Welcome everybody to the Violence, Abuse and Mental Health Network second webinar, which focuses on violence against women and girls, intersectionality and COVID-19. The focus was chosen because Black, minoritized and disabled women and girls are facing a dual pandemic of violence against women and COVID-19, and because their needs and experiences are too often invisible within the response. Today we're joined by four fantastic speakers. We have Dr. Ravi Tiara, who is a VAMHN co-investigator, a principal research fellow in gender violence and director of the Centre for the Study of Safety and Wellbeing at the University of Warwick. We have Samantha Roy, who is the head of research and development at VAMHN. We have Eleanor Lisney, who is the founder member and coordinator of Sisters of Frida, and Dr. Akima Thomas, founder and clinical director of the Women and Girls Network. Thank you to all of you for joining us. The event quickly booked out and we're delighted to be hosting so many of you. Some of you will be really familiar with the work of VAMHN and have been to our previous in-person and online events, so thank you for joining us again here today. Others among you might be joining us for the first time and be less familiar with what we do, so welcome, and we look forward to hearing about your work and how you'd like to work with us. If I can tell you a little bit about the network to start off with, for those who haven't been to one of our events before. We're funded by UK Research and Innovation, and we aim to understand, prevent and reduce the impact of domestic and sexual violence and abuse on mental health. We bring together people from different backgrounds, from sectors and disciplines with different ways of working and thinking about domestic and sexual violence, abuse and mental health. Some people have personal experience of these issues, some have expertise drawn from the work that they do, and some have both. Our work follows three themes: the definition and measurement of violence, abuse and mental health, understanding the impact and pathways between violence, abuse and mental health, and interventions to prevent and reduce those impacts on mental health. This year, our activities and in today's event is focused primarily on the theme of understanding. Part of what we do is hosting events such as these and sharing resources to help share information and build connections between our members. We also work to build the capacity of researchers working in violence, abuse and mental health. This is through our grant writing workshops and researcher bursaries. You can find information online about that, and we don't limit this to researchers embedded within universities. It's also open to people conducting research independently or in the third or public sector. Another important strand of our work is supporting the conduct of new research. Last week, we launched our competition for grants of up to £25,000 for research that seeks to increase understanding of violence, abuse and mental health problems. And the deadline to apply to that is the 11th of December 2020. Again, information is on our website. Before I introduce our speakers, just a few notes about how we're going to be running the webinar today. We have four speakers working across three presentations. Each will last 10 to 15 minutes and the speakers will take questions immediately after their talk. If you've got a question that you'd like to put to one of the presenters, please type the letter Q and then your question into the chat window, and I will put your question to the speakers during the Q&A session. Please be aware that we are recording the webinar and we'll post the recording online, but we won't be making the chat log publicly available. And if you're tweeting about our event today, please could you use the hashtag #VAMHN. Finally, I want to acknowledge that many people in the webinar today will have been affected by violence, abuse and mental health difficulties, and I just really want to ask everyone to be conscious of that throughout our interactions today. If you need to step away from the discussions at any time, please do. The recording will of course be available to you after the event, and if you decide to log out of the webinar, you'll be able to dial back in using the original link. So I'd like then to introduce our first speakers, Dr. Ravi Tiara and Samantha Roy, whose talk locates the experiences and consequences of violence against Black and minoritized women and girls in structural inequalities. They'll also be exploring the impact that COVID-19 has had on minoritized women and on specialist BME violence against women and girls support services. Ravi and Samantha, if I could pass across to you, please. I can't hear you.
You need to just put your audio on.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, my computer's being a bit temperamental today. Thank you, Sian. Thank you for asking us to speak today. I'm going to start off the presentation and then Ravi and I are going to share it between us. I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about IMCAN and who we are. IMCAN is a second-tier support organisation for the led by and for Black and minoritized women's sector working to end violence against women and girls in the UK. We have 41 members in England, Scotland and Wales. We provide direct support to those frontline organisations. We provide capacity building support, sustainability support, and we undertake research, strategic advocacy and policy work from a Black feminist intersectional perspective on human rights, social justice and equalities issues. Since the start of lockdown, we've been really closely monitoring what's been happening in terms of COVID-19 with our members, and we've been producing a series of position papers to share some important insights around how inequalities manifest. Since the start of COVID-19, I think Sian mentioned the phrase dual pandemic. It's a phrase that we have used since the start of lockdown. Why? We're dealing with two pandemics: violence against women and girls, which was declared as a pandemic by the World Health Organization in 2013, and coronavirus, COVID-19. During the two pandemics, violence against women and girls has increased, but for Black and minoritized women and girls, racialized discrimination and the disproportionate impact of structural inequalities have also become really exacerbated. Of course, structural inequalities are not new. It exacerbates pre-existing racialized inequalities. And for any woman and girl with protected characteristics, the two pandemics increase her risks at multiple interlocking levels. You will know that there have been increases in violence against women and girls reported globally. Restrictive measures increase all forms of VAWG, whether we're talking about sexual violence, sexual harassment, racial discrimination, racialized forms of VAWG, and other forms of violence impacting Black and minoritized women and girls, disproportionately due to existing inequalities. We agree with EVOR, as we do with other agencies, that COVID-19 doesn't cause abuse, but it creates a conducive context. And we know that some of our members have spoken about the stay-at-home measures means that they're seeing women with much heightened levels, at the point that the levels of violence and abuse have become much heightened. Pre-lockdown, we also know that inequalities existed. Minoritized women are disproportionately harmed by issues such as domestic homicide. The system itself doesn't respond well to patterns of multiple perpetration. It often responds to a set of norms framed around domestic violence. Unless intentionally designed by specialist organizations, support systems are not designed to center the issues and needs faced by minoritized women and girls. When women encounter poor service responses within institutions, whether it's in the form of racialized and gender stereotypes, assumptions, ableism, homophobia, etc., the system itself perpetuates its own secondary forms of harm. And we know that this is a conversation that has its own very particular and unique historical context in the UK. Inequalities that are structural and that become institutionalized produce specific vulnerabilities and harm. In other words, you can't look at the disproportionately high rates of infection and mortality in minoritized groups without looking at access to quality health and social care, legal, housing, employment, education support, and life opportunities. 40% of the women who used VME services during COVID were destitute due to insecure immigration status and their socio-economic circumstances. The context made pre-existing concerns much more visible. Despite a surge in demand and complexity of issues that women are facing, a quarter of our members spoke about, we carried out a survey with them, one of the surveys that we carried out with them, they spoke about a fear that they wouldn't survive another 6 months under the COVID-19 crisis. And this is a sector that's already been significantly impacted by decades of austerity measures and systematic de-investment. At the start of lockdown, Specialists led by and for Black and minoritized women's organisations were already underfunded by 39%. In the first month of lockdown, management capacity was stretched by 50%, meaning that half of the organisations had no capacity to do emergency fundraising as managers were pulled in to deliver frontline support. And yet, we still lack ring-fence funding for women subject to the most barriers to support, and organisations are supporting the most complex needs with less resource. We can't meaningfully address inequalities unless we're also willing to look at multi-level system change, something that's very much at the heart of Imkan's work. Otherwise, it's always going to feel like a plaster. I'm going to hand over to Ravi now to talk a little bit about the impacts on women and organisations.
Thanks, Shamanta. So just, when we're looking at offering support to Black and minoritized women under the pandemic, I think it's important to look at what organisations are doing under normal circumstances and how those things get changed or amplified under the pandemic. So there's extensive research evidence about the violence and abuse experiences and its consequences for minoritized women. So we know that their intersectional location and their situational context shape their experiences, the effects and the responses from others. And if we understand these, then we also get an idea of the work that specialist BME FORG organisations do. So just very quickly, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this, women report interconnected and overlapping forms of violence by multiple perpetrators across transnational spaces. They live with abuse for longer, they experience serious violence, there's often greater numbers of perpetrators involved, and there's greater levels of isolation, barriers, and often a reluctance to seek help because of the factors that Shamanta's talked about. There's also a body of research which highlights the great complexity in terms of effects of these violence and abuse experiences. So the high levels of isolation and distress, the multiple pressures that they're subjected to, and the lack of support and networks, and particularly greater uncertainty in life due to immigration status. And this results in what we know now to be a disproportionate impact in terms of mental distress. And again, researchers highlighted this, though it's a bit dated. So, Stark and Flitcraft in their study highlighted disproportionate impact on the mental well-being of Black women as compared to white women. Bugra et al., told us that Asian women under 30 were 2.5 times more likely than white women to self-harm and so on. And, we're kind of familiar with the issues. This is, a really challenged space, the issue of accessing support for their mental well-being. So we know, for instance, that African Caribbean women are reluctant to access mental health services, given the problematic history of pathologization of Black people. So they'll live with issues for years. Asian women are more likely to present with depression and are offered medication if they're believed, rather than counselling support or even asked about violence and abuse. And I'm sure Akima will say more about this. And of course, this is the common experience for survivors, as we wrote in our article in 2003, which highlighted how distress as symptoms of abuse requires specialist interventions from those with understanding and insight. So the issue isn't just about medication itself, but women having control over the use of medication and the extent to which it's used as part of a holistic intervention that supports in their recovery. In our recent research that Shamanta and I carried out through the auspices of the university and Imkan on sexual violence, all of the women reported experiencing mental distress for several years and being offered little else other than prescription medication. A woman who'd had issues, talked about being put on 11 different medication, which made it difficult for her to function on a day-to-day basis. And she talks very strongly about professionals re-traumatizing her through their failure to address the underlying causes of her problems. And this then creates issues and challenges around unemployment, homelessness, and disrupted education. Migrant women, and we've read a lot about the issues for migrant women under the pandemic, were especially likely to report high levels of mental and psychological distress, not least because of the uncertainty that's created by the hostile environment, and sometimes the inherent lack of belief about their violence and abuse experiences in the system. And for the majority of these women in our study, the consequences were beginning to be addressed through specialist support from BME women's organisations. So understanding the historical and current intersectional location of minoritized women and their communities and the processes of racialization that add to the trauma of violence is imperative to more effectively facilitate minoritized survivors' healing. But we also know that they faced discriminatory service responses. And, our research highlighted that it took women 2 to 7 years from the time they started looking for support to find positive interventions. And Black women are more likely to be subject to a policing or forensic intervention and institutionalization rather than therapeutic wraparound support and advocacy that's needed following a mental health crisis. There's issues for migrant women. So in terms of the hostile environment, data sharing with immigration authorities and the potential for enforcement action deters migrant women from seeking health or other care. And of course, the recent DA bill has excluded migrant women from support and protection despite lobbying efforts. Specialist services like IMCAN members have crafted a response over the last 40 years, which responds to what women value and need. And they consistently talk about the importance of physical and emotional safety through services that they see themselves in, where their issues are understood without explanation, where the intersecting impact of racism and sexism, where they're likely to encounter pathologization and judgment, makes that support from specialist services all the more important, especially around intersectional advocacy. I think that work is pretty established, and if anybody's interested in reading more about what women value, then we've provided a reference to our recent report. So I just want to share some initial findings regarding women from the recent research that's been done under the pandemic, which is going to appear as a position paper in the series that IMCAN is producing. So clearly, like other DVA VOG services, BME services have also had to rapidly change to remote working. And what they tell us is that the bigger organizations have been better placed to do this, as is to be expected, and do it more seamlessly than the smaller ones because of resources. So one organization, said that all staff needed to be equipped, and that grew from a staff of 3 to 21 needing equipment. And the impact on women has been huge. While some have engaged well to remote online support, there are concerningly others who've disengaged because it requires women to have access to a telephone or a laptop and to feel safe to make contact. And some of the women that are being supported, don't even have a bed to sleep on, let alone access to a laptop. Women are also used to meeting support workers, solicitors, counsellors, etc., face to face. It's part of them feeling reconnected with others. And this lack of face to face contact has been a shock for women who have no support in the country. They feel completely isolated. And these are women who often need intensive support. So some women have gone back or stayed with perpetrators. Other perpetrators have taken advantage of COVID and thrown women out. Some have been forced to call the police because men are in the house all the time and they get no respite. Services have also reported a huge increase in the number of no recourse cases, and statutory services or mainstream VAWG services don't want to take on cases, so they're lumping all women together and actually dumping those women onto specialist services. As Shamanta mentioned, women are also reporting a higher threshold, so they're contacting services when things are getting really bad. And I think it'll be interesting to see a breakdown of the homicide figures when they're available. So, you know, I think the picture that's painted is an exacerbation of what we know already, which is that there's a reluctance on the part of mainstream services to take on complex cases, and therefore they're being dumped on already smaller and less well-funded BME specialist organisations. Just to end very quickly, there's also creative solutions that some have developed. So one service told us that they've created a tech bank for women to sign out iPads and laptops, etc., so that women get access to some of that equipment that they don't have at home. Shamanta, I'll just pass on to you to finish off.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts on staff and organisations. In the current context, staff are definitely having to work a lot more outside of the hours, as women are obviously trying to find spaces, safe times to be able to call and make contact with staff when they can. And all the focus has been inevitably on women to ensure the right support is in place online, and and in that process, there has been probably a limited space to think about the needs of staff themselves, who are constantly working without any outlet in their home spaces. Challenges of working from home: some are going from room to room while supporting women to deal with trauma, which is incredibly stressful. So home, in a sense, becomes a place of trauma for them. Some organisations have been talking about offering an additional 30% more emotional support. Lots of court proceedings and appointments have been cancelled, which all raise anxiety. Some staff are also, living with extended family or other people in their home environment, so working and meeting the needs of the whole family, as well as trying to do, highly stressful kind of jobs. This has an incredible effect on staff's physical and mental health, especially senior managers, and some say their health has deteriorated during this period. Some of the quotes here from staff really, I think, make the point really quite strongly. You find yourself exhausted, you're carrying the whole organisation, it all falls on your shoulders. I've never felt like this, it's coming from all directions. I'm still having to write funding bids to ensure the continuation of services and staff. It's 7 days a week, evenings, you find yourself overcompensating for staff. You just have to get on and do it, it's a huge load. As a manager, I feel if I take a break, then the wheels will stop. It's a non-stop circle. I feel everything is my responsibility. So those quotes really highlight the kind of pressures that organisations and staff are under. Intersectional advocacy, as Ravi mentioned, is a crucial intervention. Staff say that some of the responses of agencies have been appalling. More time has been spent chasing agencies, filling out sometimes 5-page referral forms, doing the interpreting, overall greater levels of work. Organisations have been responding by managers doing more regular check-ins with staff, offering clinical supervision if they're funded, having greater flexible working hours approach. Some housing departments are insisting they want to see women, so staff are having to organise the logistics of being on the same call while they're shielding, women are shielding, which is in itself quite stressful. And as Ravi said, there's been an increase in cases of no recourse to public funds. Overall, there's a much higher workload on an under-resourced sector. So it's really clear that the by and for sector for BME women, as other by and for organisations, needs much more sustainable funding solution, and much of the funding that's been available during this period is, whilst welcome, has been short term and sometimes needs to be spent far too quickly, and it certainly won't address the longer term issues and needs that the sector needs. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. There's so much to pull out of your talk, and I'm really glad that you've been able to pull out the challenges that women are experiencing as individuals, but also that organisations are facing, and how that this has been exacerbated, has been exacerbating so much of what was going on before. I'm waiting for some questions to come through. Two have just landed. I'm just going to read them out to you. So the first one: Black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women, and Asian women are twice as likely, and neonatal mortality rates remain high for BAME women. I've heard reports from some quarters that BAME women are experiencing poor care and racism during the pandemic. Have you found any links to your work to these issues? So a question about poor care and racism in relation to maternity care. Is that something your work would pick up on?
Yeah, we haven't worked, and we haven't come across that in this research, but I guess it's not unsurprising. You know, certainly the picture that we get from the work that we've been doing is kind of greater challenges in the response from statutory services across the board. And some workers feeling, you know, now they've got an excuse not to pick up the phone or whatever. So much time being spent on chasing people up and getting them to respond and so on. And I think in a situation where there's no or limited accountability, it's not surprising that some of those issues are rising. And I think, you know, though the disproportionate impact of COVID on BAME communities, I think is concerning, it's also leading to particular perceptions and views about those communities, and you know, and some of the kind of the racist harassment and violence, racialized violence that Shamanta was talking about. So some of those issues aren't surprising, but our work hasn't looked at that directly.
Thank you. And Shamanta, if I can perhaps put the second question to you, can you excuse me, can you tell us a bit more about other services' reluctance to take more complex cases? Is this because they're not able to understand minority women's cases, or is it a form of institutionalized racism, or perhaps something else?
Sometimes I'm thinking about some of my conversations with our members, that complexity gets used as the frame for what I would consider an institutionally racist response. So sometimes staff will say that that the specific issues facing Black and minoritized women will get framed as complex, as a way of some agencies saying that, you know, we're not sure we're the best people to provide support. And in the current context, there's definitely been members that have spoken about statutory services maybe using, oh, we don't have the funding, it's too complex, we're not sure. And there being some really, this context being utilised and instrumentalised in a way for some poor responses. So I think, yeah. And on the other side, there are organisations that would be better placed to support Black and minoritized women as well. So it's not just a question of that, but it's a question of having really good, effective structures in place for, you know, referral, assessment, pathways, support, that kind of thing. But there's definitely been a rolling back. And interestingly enough, one of our members, I'm just thinking about what they were saying, is that we're doing what we normally do, kind of often under the radar with very little funding, but it's just become a much harder now, you know, because of the context that women are living in and the kinds of violence they're subject to.
Thank you. And we have time for one last question before we move on to our second speaker. What do you think we as a network can do to support services and minoritized women moving forwards?
It's a very big question. I was thinking, could you repeat the question again? What could...
One that we want to actually come back to at the end of the panel. So I'll read it out again so everybody can be holding it in their minds. What do you think as a network we can be doing to support services and minoritized women moving forwards?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll return to that. Okay. Thank you both very much. We should hopefully have some time at the end of the webinar to discuss as a group any kind of overarching questions that come through. So I'd like now please to welcome Eleanor Lisney of the Sisters of Frida. Sisters of Frida is an experimental collective of disabled women that works to develop new ways of sharing experiences, mutual support and relationships with different networks. Eleanor is a founder member and coordinator of Sisters of Frida. And she'll be speaking today about the impact of COVID-19 on disabled women and the erosions of rights enshrined by the Care Act 2014 under the Coronavirus Act of 2020. Eleanor, thank you very much. I'll pass across to you.
Hi, can you all hear me?
We can.
Good, thank you. I should first of all say that I'm not exactly coordinator, I'm a director of Sisters of Frida. I should explain a little bit more about Sisters of Frida, if that's okay. We're mostly intersectional. We deal with any issue or most issues that concerns disabled women. So we go to the whole, lot of, as I said, issues. Come back to the COVID-19, I should say that we've written a report. It's not exactly a report because what we thought was more important was the perspectives of disabled women under COVID-19. So it's very much the voices. So we tried to get different disabled women to give quotes about how they've been and what they think. So rather, it's not academic, it's more, like I said, voices of disabled women under different, we did it under different headings. So when I said intersectional, it means that we deal with disabled mothers, we deal with VAMHN, disabled women issues, etc. Let me just go on. As has mentioned, Ashanda, one of the most important things that come out from the pandemic is the Coronavirus Act. The Coronavirus Act this year raises many concerns in regards to the rights of disabled people as a whole, and this includes disabled women. And particularly concerning are the measures which weaken the safeguarding against abuse within mental health settings. For instance, time limits have been extended on psychiatric detention. Now it only requires one doctor to authorize someone's sectioning, and no second medical opinion is necessary before forcing psychiatric medicine upon someone against their will. And these measures will disproportionately affect members of the VAMHN community who are already overrepresented in detention, stay in psychiatric hospitals for longer, and are 8 times more likely to be subjected to forced outpatient treatment. the reference, if you look at our report, and I think there will be a link somewhere, is there. These are unprecedented times, as everybody say, but weakening the safeguards in an already coercive Mental Health Act and extending its powers is a grave step and risks the rights of disabled people. This is said by Akiko Hart. Given the serious implications of the Coronavirus Act, for some of the people it seeks to protect, it's vital that the government ensure that new law doesn't undermine rights and do lasting harm. This is very important because disabled activists have been fighting for a long time for the rights, and that is being seriously eroded by this new act. The Coronavirus Act also essentially suspends the 2014 Care Act duties of local authorities in England to provide social care services to all who are eligible, leaving disabled adults at risk of neglect in their own homes. And this has been mentioned by a great number of disabled women that we know that has responded in saying how they are panicking at the result of the undermining of the Care Act. It also means a relaxation of the standards of educational support for disabled children, which will disproportionately affect women as they are more likely to be primary carers. Give me a second. Go to disabled parents, disabled mothers. Many disabled parents rely on their child being at school or nursery immensely to allow them to recharge, and that doesn't change whether you're disabled or non-disabled. Not having a rest causes their symptoms of their condition to worsen, frequent falls and feeling like they're failing their children through increased pain and fatigue, making them unable to do quality time activities and adequate homeschooling. There's more pressure on their partner to assist them because PAs during the COVID-19 aren't turning up. But I'm hearing that many partners are also key workers. I think disabled parents are seen to be needing to send to school setting key workers being accommodated in a health need for the parent, and there's no transport, etc. I'm going to quote for somebody I actually know, but she doesn't want her name to be there. She says, she's supporting 2 female clients who have learning difficulties. Both of these clients' children are subject to care proceedings. Their children are currently not living with them. Before the lockdown, they're still having contact in a contact center supervised. But since the lockdown, they have not been allowed to contact due to contact centers being closed. So you can see that sort of stress there are on disabled parents on top of stresses that are borne by non-disabled parents, because advocacy for disabled parents and disabled people, disabled mothers, disabled women is so important, and in COVID-19 a lot of that has been restricted because of lockdown. I'm going to now the domestic abuse, and I'm not going to stress a lot on that because I think it's been already spoken a little bit by Khan, only about disabled women, of course, and it's more important, I wouldn't say more important, but it's hugely significant for women with learning difficulties. because they no longer have one-to-one access to their advocates and might not be able to communicate. And they have communication issues, not just also for deaf people, not just because of British Sign Language access, also because of the social distancing. Communication means it only can be handled by phone. Quickly, because I have to stop soon, there's also disabled women in prison. 1% of people in prison could die, according to epidemiologists, if the coronavirus spreads across the state, resulting in 800 deaths. Many prisoners already have pre-existing and severe health conditions. So disabled people in prisons, disabled women in prisons are overrepresented, and this means that they will be disproportionately represented because of due to deaths caused by the pandemic. So feels like that. I'm going to finish on one quote. It says that it feels like the narrative about disabled women is very one-dimensional. There is no consideration that disabled women occupy multiple roles. This woman here says, as a disabled woman who's a key worker, student, employer, or personal assistant, a family member and friend, being told to remain housebound for a minimum of 12 weeks is not straightforward. The label that persists and consistently applied to me is of a vulnerable person. The multi-dimensional lives we live are made invisible. The overwhelming feeling for me is that of invisibility. We are expected to survive at home with little or no additional statutory support while our rights are being eroded. The threat to me to live an independent life on the other side feels massive. Juggling the demands of my job and cause while managing the additional stress that disabled people are facing has been challenged. I'm gonna stop there because I'm sure there'll be questions asked. And I hope I've come and explained a bit about the intersectional focus that we have. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Eleanor. Just actually on a point of terminology before I turn to the main questions, we had an early question to ask, what do you mean by mostly intersectional? Could you just say a bit more about that, please?
We say mostly intersectional because I think sometimes I get tired of the word intersectional. My friend there had said multi-dimensional. I think mainly because intersectional, as you have said, it's sometimes a jargon word, a technical word. A lot of people use it now, and they do not always they don't always understand the term. I think some people use intersectional as sort of alternative for diversity, which I'm sure it doesn't happen in this audience. But I just said mostly intersectional because of that. Because when you're intersectional, it's sort of like different oppressions, but then we also think about work, employment, and etc.
Okay, thank you.
Hope that helps.
Thank you. In some of your briefing papers, you've called for preparations for pandemics to include preparations for the needs of disabled women. And I wonder if you could say something about what you would include in key considerations in crisis planning in relation to disabled women who are experiencing violence and abuse.
I think for most disabled women, it would be support. Support when this is unprecedented, everybody says. I don't think people realize what would happen if there is a lockdown, because, you know, we haven't experienced a lockdown. In a lockdown, for me, is your personal assistants, your carer, as some people call it, can't turn up. So preparations would be, what would the local authorities have in place if the people you have to be on furlough because they have childcare issues, or because they live in a house with 7 other people, and you can't be sure that they would be, you know, safe to come into your house because of the risk that that they have as a member of a, you know, 6 people who go out to work in hospitals and etc. Would you want somebody on high risk to come to care for you? In some of these instances, very intimate type of care.
Thank you. And a question from the webinar participants: what can we do to get mainstream organisations to take an intersectional and multidimensional focus in their work? This is still not happening in many places.
I think it's just to keep focusing on it. I know I've said, you know, a lot of people use the term intersectional, but sometimes you have to use that term. And, you know, it's to HR to ask them if they have. I think I work a lot with how to diversify the workforce, and sometimes we use the word intersectional in those terms, but they don't accept intersectional in those places. You know, it's what you call mainstream organizations, because intersectional talks about oppression, talks about discrimination. So I don't know is the answer. I mean, if you're in a workforce, do you talk about you talk about where you need to think about hiring more diverse workforce. You need to have more disabled people, you need to have more VAME and etc. You wouldn't exactly say that you have to bring in their protected characteristics when you're considering hiring people, for example. So in a mainstream organization, if I can mention that, I went to a conference specifically on intersectionality, and it's a prominent feminist. She did not mention disability in the whole hour. In that case, then, you know, I think it should be mentioned, except that I didn't feel like as the only visibly disabled person, I didn't feel like putting up my hand and say, hey, you've forgotten us. You know, or in a disability conference, you know, sometimes I'm the only, and again I would say only visibly VAME person. Again, you know, I in those places actually I do put out my hand and say, what about VAME disabled people? Have you included them? So it all depends, and also it depends on your energy and how capable or how well you feel about putting your head above a parapet. Sometimes, mostly in mainstream organizations, as is said, it's not often accepted.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful to be talking about the work involved and the toll it takes to be feeling like you're the person who's always having to put up your hand and raise that point, and really the need for it to be taken much more widely.
Can I say something? Add something? Yeah. In one of the conferences, and I get asked to talk about intersectionality more and more these days, and I said that being an intersectional person is a bit like you are invited to a lot of tables, but in each of the tables you can't find a place to sit down properly, because there is, you don't actually fit exactly there. And that's how I feel sometimes about the problems of being intersectional, is that, if you're disabled, then you don't always fit in the BAME table. If you're a BAME, you don't always fit in the disabled. Yeah, I don't have to go on.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much, Anna. I'm going to move on now to our third speaker, but hopefully you're able to stay on the call to rejoin at the end of the talks. I'd like now to introduce Dr. Akima Thomas from the Women and Girls Network, which is a free women-only service that supports women in London who've experienced violence or who are at risk of violence. Akima is the founder and clinical director of Women and Girls Network, who has pioneered working from a trauma-informed approach and has developed a strengths-based model based on a non-pathologizing clinical model called the Holistic Empowerment Recovery Model, or HER. Akima's talk will be exploring the challenges of COVID-19 and the impact on the mental health and well-being of Black and minoritized women surviving experiences of violence and violence against women and girls. Akima, I think you do have slides, so I'll pass across to you and hopefully you can share your screen. Thank you ever so much.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm just going to see if technology works. Thank you for joining me here. And absolutely, I think there's something about how we understand the COVID crisis, but also I think we pointed, and Shamanta and Ravi pointed to exactly about the other pandemic in terms of violence against women and girls. And I guess for me, I also wanted to bring up the other pandemic, which is about intersectional violence and the experience of racism. I think certainly at Women and Girls Network, we've experienced lots of women with challenges with COVID, in terms of, okay, let me see if my screen is now working. There we are, okay. So let me just get myself sorted out here. And okay, so there is my self-portrait. That was my joke for today, but anyway, this is me during lockdown. So yes, as I was just saying about the other pandemics that are also happening as well, in terms of the experience of racism, certainly for women who have been accessing Women and Girls Network, Black and minoritized women. They've talked about absolutely how COVID-19 has created further isolation, lack of services, and I think all the things that have been illustrated. But I think absolutely we understand about women and who have experienced much more experiences of violence and what that's meant for women and girls and the dangers. And I think we can't also neglect thinking about young women in particular as well, and homelessness, and there's been those critical points in families that young women have found themselves homeless, and that risk of destitution that lots of Black and minoritized young women have found themselves in. But also let's think about the crisis within the crisis, which is of racism. So, and I think certainly the Black Lives Matter, and I think there's something for us about thinking as a community that Black lives don't matter. And that's been really kind of an important turning point for us to be thinking about, well, what does that look like in terms of services? How do Black women and minoritized women access services? So there's something more about the critique of COVID-19 and how it's brought all of those elements of the ailments of society to the surface. And I guess I did want to kind of talk about, you know, that what that life in the margins looks like, and certainly Shimanta and Ravi have spoken very eloquently about what that looks like in terms of those levels of intersectional disadvantage. And we know that those higher rates of unemployment, high rates of contact with the criminal justice system, Black people are 4 times more likely to be arrested and detained under the Mental Health Act. So those are really important things for us to be thinking about. And also those experiences of poverty, and absolutely how that impacts on the well-being on a physical level, on a psychological level, in terms of Black and minoritized people's health. So you know that those communities have higher rates of suicide, higher rates of psychosis, homelessness, PTSD, higher rates of not being offered the same kind of access to services as other communities. So we'll have less access to those early and those preventative treatment options, like talking therapies, are really important for us to think about as well. I'm sorry, Eleanor, I did want to put up the slide on intersectionality, because I do think it gives us a way of articulating and contextualizing the experiences of Black and minoritized communities in terms of those overlapping experiences of oppression and what that looks like. And I think it illustrates absolutely that holistic lens, that absolutely, and I think you, Eleanor, you kind of described that really kind of eloquently in terms of that not being able to be fitted into any one place. This gives us that holistic lens to understand that levels of oppression and discrimination that can happen, and that those unique and dynamic challenges impacting on the most marginalised communities. And I think also we need to represent and understand that structural inequality, it loses lives. Lives disappear because of intersectional disadvantage. That actually we can think about individuals falling into a chasm, but actually an intersectional lens gives us a sense of understanding, actually not they're falling, they're being pushed. So something a lot more active. I also wanted to talk to the experience of Black and minoritized women's experiences of trauma. And I think we're really familiar with concepts of trauma and what it means. And I'm hoping what this does is give us a sense of that continuum of trauma that many of our Black and minoritized women experience in terms of that historical trauma. That trauma that's ever evolving, historically linked to massive hurts and massive discriminations, massive killings that have happened. Those experiences of slavery, genocide, you know, all of those kind of great big colonization, all of those things that have happened that become the background hum, that are passed, transmitted genetically, epigenetically along the continuum of communities is really important for us to consider. As is the past and the present intersectional trauma. What do those microaggressions look like? How do they impact on the psyche of the individual? What does intergenerational trauma look like in terms of what's it like to be in families where we have, where there's a linkage of numerous experiences and intergenerational experiences of violence against women and girls? What do those single events of trauma look like? That woman who's experienced a rape, absolutely a catastrophe as far as she's concerned, but is a single event. And then those developmental and complex traumas in terms of how we understand what it might be like for children who have experienced trauma at a very critical window of their development. So understanding what that whole continuum of trauma, so we have many of our Black and minoritized women have experienced all 5 of those different types of trauma. And also, how do we understand what the root of that hurt looks like? What does it mean for, and absolutely, we've been very keenly aware of racism, a lot of conversations at the moment, because I guess COVID did kind of mean that it was inescapable for us to think, to ignore the impact of racism in terms of what had happened to Joy Floyd and Breonna Taylor, in terms of that ongoing, pervasive experiences of racism that sends a shockwave that is unexpected and is bound up in interpersonal spaces as well as bound up to institutions. What do those microaggressions look like? How do they accumulate over time into those macroaggressions? How does that impact on the psyche, on the well-being of Black and minoritized communities? Talk a lot about unconscious racial biases, but for the Black community, they're experienced very consciously and send a shockwave through our whole being. That racial gaslighting, misogynoir in terms of the hatred, so those 2 points of intersection coming together, Black hatred and also the hatred of women, and absolutely creating a discrimination and inequality that impacts on our freedoms, our liberties, our choices, our opportunities, and present a real danger to our levels of mobility. I wanted to talk about soul pain, and I think this a quote by Louise Adjua Parker really kind of gives us a sense of what that meaning of that. Racial abuse pierces your skin, embeds itself inside of you. It gives a sense of the profundity of it. We know it has a physical entity. We know that the vagal nerve becomes very activated, bringing on that fight and flight response. So really a terrible physical experience as well. That soul wound. So what's the legacy? How does that get replayed in terms of intrusion of thoughts, avoidance mechanisms, anxiety clusters of anger, depression, low self-esteem? We might recognise these actually as being related to PTSD symptoms, except for PTSD, that's really in the past. There's something about that as being a past event. And this speaks to, racial trauma speaks to a current, ongoing, pervasive re-experiencing that for us as Black and minoritized communities, we can never escape. That sense of alienation, the sense of unbelonging that has a physical and psychological space of not feeling ever that we can connect and be in a place that we don't feel helpless and powerless. And there's something as well about our injuries and understanding this isn't a way about pathologizing the Black community even further, but it is a way to understand the impact and the profundity of those injuries. Absolutely, the barriers for Black and minoritized women accessing services, what happens to those Eurocentric models of therapy, of the way that services are constructed in terms of how they might other Black and minoritized communities. What happens when we don't have practitioners who have a cultural literacy, who actually have a colourblind approach, are in denial, minimise or justify racism. So there's something about that invisibility that many Black women will talk about. They will talk about actually, because their experience isn't held, they will talk about actually in their 50 minutes with white therapists about feeling that actually they've experienced a gaslighting, that they've racial gaslighting, that they've experienced not being understood, not being held, that they felt interrogated, that they felt that they've had to defend that position. And so you can feel the fragility then with the therapeutic space in terms of that rupture is always omnipresent as well. Yes, so, okay, so there's something about what can we do? So there is absolutely important things that can be done. And I think the antidote, I've called it that antidote in terms of, and this is quoting some of the work of Nawai Larasirai, in terms of how we understand those safety. And safety is absolutely the absence of harm. What does that look like in terms of spaces where women can fully be themselves, where they can be heard, where they can be not blamed, not that they can feel that they're not going to be judged on what they're saying. So those are places of self-determination. What would the support like? The support needs to absolutely consider what it's like for Black women and minoritized women in terms of the impact of racism. What do we need to do in terms of our different ways that we work in, that acknowledgement, that validation, that authenticity in terms of how we hold all of those different parts of the self as well. And absolutely, there's something about those microaggressions and how it's really important that we have spaces where we're able to work back in terms of those micro interventions. Not that they counterbalance one another, but there is something about that pushback in terms of real definite cultural competencies that we can include in our practice. And something about social justice, maybe as a main element as well, because otherwise, if we go into those spaces with Black and minoritized women and we hear their experiences of violence and oppression in terms of their intersectional experiences of disadvantage, if we just listen to that and we don't do anything, we just become further bystanders. We just become a witness, and there's something about a witnessing that means that we do nothing in those spaces. So there is something about a call to create something around social justice, to be fighting for social justice is absolutely key to the work that we're doing as well. And my final slide, 2 minutes, okay. So my final slide is the holistic empowerment model, the HER model, which is 7 different domains in terms of looking at that environment of gender inequality, working from the heart, absolutely understanding the women's strengths and all what they do to survive in terms of their resistance and the rebellion to ensure the survival. In terms of our trauma-informed approach, which also needs to include, not just about the trauma in that immediacy of war, but also in terms of their other experiences. That recovery model is in terms of absolutely, it's a question of hope, absolutely working intersectionally in terms of having a way that we understand cultural competency that allows us to move through and towards other communities. And finally, our holistic practice in terms of looking at what that means in terms of working on the different levels of self in terms of mind, body and soul. Wow, I think that's going to be the end of my presentation. That's Women and Girls Network, and I'm going to go back to stopping the screen slide. So that was very quick.
Okay, that was remarkable. Thank you. That was a lot of information really, really clearly provided. Thank you so much. I have a first question that has come through. That was great, is the comment. Could you say more about micro-interventions as a counter or antidote to microaggressions, please?
Yeah, again, I mean, it's a big piece and a big conversation, but I think it's about the intention. It's about the intention about practitioners recognising that they need to deal with themselves in terms of their own personal awareness. How do we also understand the different skills and the different knowledge? How do we get that knowledge and how do we get those skills? So it is about those open conversations. It is about our call to action. It is about our commitment to be driving forward. So how do we call out oppression? How do we also make sure that our organisations are working from those culturally competent practices? How do we have this as a constant dialogue, as a constant CPD that I would like other professional organisations like BACP to be taking on as a requirement, as a skill set, as a competency?
Thank you. A question from Clarissa: is the HER model based on trauma-informed care identified by SAMHSA in the US? I saw that there was one of the components of the HER model is trauma-informed care. Perhaps you could say a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that the rest of the world is caught up with feminist practice, which is about mutuality, care, safety, recognising collaboration, making sure about practitioner trustworthy, and absolutely that informs trauma-informed approach, and trauma-informed care forms the basis of our work. So making sure that we've got that phased approach to how we engage with survivors around their experiences of trauma is really vital. Yeah.
And do you have any advice for organisations such as local authorities to audit their services against the HER model? Or its
that would be fantastic if we could, you know, and we've got, you know, advances like Blackburn is probably the first trauma-informed city that we have. So there are huge ways that we can equip services, agencies, whole boroughs to be working from that trauma-informed approach. So it is a willingness to engage, to realise the endemic nature of violence against women and girls, and also be committed to doing something about it, and listen to organisations like Women and Girls Network that has been working for 30 years in the field. So absolutely, absolutely.
When you say that Blackburn has become a trauma-informed city, could you say a little bit more about the types of steps you've been taking?
Yeah, so everything from whether it's hotels to shops to police to social care, so a whole way that they've understood about violence, how they've understood about the importance of not traumatising survivors by asking direct questions, by creating more conducive environments in terms of colours of rooms, soft furnishings, the kind of questions that they ask, how they're more receptive to trauma and reactivating trauma responses.
Thank you. Could you say a bit more about racial gaslighting, please?
Yeah, I think it's something that the Black and minoritized community that we experience a lot in terms of, you know, how we understand about our reality is always undermined. So it's about a way that the Black and minority community get blamed. It's a way that someone will say, really? Did that really happen? So there's something about undermining our truths and our reality. That's and that spooky kind of feeling. So nothing explicit, but below the radar that provides a discrediting, and something about, you know, something that changes somebody's reality. So that's what racial gaslighting means.
Thank you. Another question, is there evidence or policy that states that trauma-informed care should be widely implemented? And just while you're thinking about it, I just want to flag that there was quite, that one of the pieces of work that we did as a network towards the end of last year was around implementing trauma-informed care across a variety of settings. And we do have a briefing pack on the resources page of our website that pulls together quite a lot of evidence and practice on trauma-informed care. But Akima, is there anything that you'd like to say about the kind of evidence-based for trauma-informed practice?
I think we've had this evidence base that has been growing for the last 20 years. So actually, I think, you know, there is, you know, so there's something about an intention and a willingness to embrace trauma-informed care. You know, for us, it's the interventions that it provides is more cost-effective, is more humanly, you know, holds a human much more safely, and is more conducive to us. So I think there's overwhelming evidence actually that both this country and the US has. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in the other panelists as well at this point, if the other panelists could unmute and put their video on, please. So just a few minutes in which we can speak as a group across some of the kind of overarching questions that have come through. And several of you across your writings and your presentations have spoken about the importance of reimagining society after the COVID-19 pandemic, and your concern really that we shouldn't be aiming for a return to normality. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about your hopes for a post-COVID future for Black, minoritized and disabled women.
I think that's a really big question. I mean, I think all of those issues that have been highlighted as challenges, it would be great if they were addressed. You know, with regards to you know, the diverse groups of marginalised women survivors that we've talked about. I think many of us in our personal lives have had conversations about how lockdown and the pandemic has created an opportunity for us to reflect about the way that we live our lives. And I hope that, you know, the opportunity is not lost in professionals reflecting on the way that they carry out their work and how they can bring a sense of kind of, you know, the global connections between people, and how, you know, Corona itself has not kind of, well, it has, you know, disproportionately affected people, but it certainly hasn't prevented the rich and the powerful and all of those, you know, privileged people from being immune to it. So in a way, the sense of connection and a sense of kind of humanity, even if we, I think, start with that from a very personal point of view, would be really, really helpful in the way that we live our lives, the way we relate to others, the way we make an effort to understand other lives, the way that we don't invisibilize, you know, the other, and so on. I think would be a really useful starting point. And if we can do that, then that can inform all sorts of practice, I think.
Yeah, I think similarly. I think, you know, there is something as well about, you know, that there's been a light that's been shone at the moment around VAMHN, around Black Lives Matter, and I think, you know, how do we keep up that momentum is going to be really important in terms of funding, in terms of creating that awareness, because actually I've noticed that you can't have the two all at the same time. So as we began with lockdown, we heard a lot around domestic violence in particular, and then we've lost that and we've heard a lot about Black Lives Matter, and it's important that we just have a synergy around thinking about all of that intersectional disadvantage and how, and the commitment to doing something else. So it is about creating awareness, but it's also having funding and sustainable funding.
Thank you. I think that touches really well on Eleanor's point about you can sit at one table at a time, and it's difficult to bring the two together. Shamanta, you want to...
Yeah, just to follow on from what the others have said, I hope it's a time, because inequalities are something that we're all working in and have been for many years, but because it's so there in a mainstream in the way that it hasn't been before, I hope it gives organisations that haven't really thought about it particularly well or haven't reflected on their own practice an opportunity to do that, whether that's about creating spaces for partnership or solidarity with organisations that are working intersectionally, working at the margins, don't have a seat around the table in a meaningful way, as Eleanor was saying, but can share power and resources. So we're not just inviting people to so that we can learn more about racism or learn more about intersectionality, but we can do something much more active around it to kind of address issues like racial gaslighting that Akima was talking about. And I hope that, you know, those organisations can also do, you know, meaningful stuff around data. And one of the things that, you know, I'm talking from a data perspective, one of the things that public institutions don't do very well is that they don't collate data that is intersectional, that they then use, that speaks. So you don't really know what the experiences of a Black disabled woman would be within a particular public sector institution, and that's really important to know who you're reaching, who you're not reaching, and what you need to do. So we'd want people to think about equalities in a much more meaningful way, you know, with action plans and outcomes and monitoring in the same way that we're all monitored by these institutions, you know. So we want there to be more accountability in those organisations.
If I could add on that, is that something that a lot of disabled women have added in is that there is no kind of people talk about the new normal. But for disabled women, that's one good thing about COVID-19 is that everybody was stuck at home. So access was more taken into consideration. And I just hope that that kind of access, physical access, environmental access, is not forgotten. You know, it used to be that, oh, I can't go to that conference because I can't access the public transport, you know, but I know a lot of us complain about Zoom meetings, but the good thing about Zoom is that it doesn't matter if you're stuck in bed, you can still attend. So, you know, in the sort of intersectional kind of way, whether you are VAMHN, whether you're Black and minoritized women, or yeah, if you're disabled, that is really, really useful thing to have non-disabled people, the general population, to realize the kind of effect that has on you when you're stuck somewhere. We've been saying, you know, look at all those webinars and say, how do you cope with being locked down at home? You say, well, we're the experts on that. We've been doing that for ages. So yeah, that would be great. I have to go and answer the door. I'll let you continue, Sean.
Sorry, just as I was muting so I could sneeze. Just thank you. I think some really important points there, and as well thinking about what some of the things that we want to hang on to as we move out of the pandemic. If I can just return us just briefly to another big question that came up earlier in the webinar about, and it touches on, Shimanta, your point about not just learning but doing. What do you think members of the network can be doing to try and make progress?
I think, Sean, it follows on from what I was saying. So maybe engage with organisations that are working intersectionally, but engage in a way that's quite meaningful. Think about partnership working, which is about, you know, a mutual exchange, but also where the smaller organisations or those that are working at the margins have opportunities to share expertise, but are resourced for that. Where you've got, spaces to also amplify ways of working with women and girls, and that could, or ways of funding approaches to understanding that better. So that organisations themselves, you know, a lot of our members do really, really important work, but they have often very limited resources to kind of showcase what they do, why that's important, and ways of working. And they don't have that in the same way that bigger mainstream organisations can access resources. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything to what I've added, I'm sure.
I think I'll just pick up on one point, which I think is a challenge for those of us who are involved in research and so on, which is about evidence and what counts as evidence and whose evidence is it. And I think Akima very eloquently talked about how Women and Girls Network has accumulated 20 years of evidence about what's effective and so on. And I think, you know, one of the questions for us as a network is, how do we tap into and recognize that evidence that kind of exists on the margins, so that we don't exclude those perhaps who don't have access to opportunities within kind of the academic world and so on.
Akima, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think it's about also how do we keep that momentum going. So how do we have, more CPD events like this? I think it's been really useful with other practitioners talking, I'm aware that we didn't have anybody from the LGBTQ community. So, how do we keep that, this subject and this alive is going to be really important. How do we share promising practice, best practice in terms of those skills? Because I think that's another thing for practitioners. We're quite hungry to know, well, what are those best interventions and how does research meet practitioners in terms of, understanding what, promising practice, how do we evolve practice as well? So I think those would be the things that I would be thinking about in terms of what the network could do.
Thank you. I'm going to start closing the webinar for today because we are at time. I was going to share some brief information about the grant competition, but I'm conscious that people will need to be logging off the call quite soon. So just very quickly to flag that our grant competition is open. It will close on the 11th of December, and our theme is understanding violence, abuse and mental health, and we have a concept note that sets out what we see as key issues for future research in this area on our website. Applications have to be led by UK higher education institutes or recognised ERC independent research organisations, but we are strongly encouraging projects that are co-led in partnership with non-academic groups, and we expect the involvement of drivers and of third sector organisations within all applications for their time and involvement to be appropriately costed. There's obviously ongoing uncertainty about the duration of social distancing measures, so within the application we'll also be asking applicants to set out how the project might proceed using remote methods if that was necessary at the time of project startup. So do check out our website for full details of the course specification, frequently asked questions, and of course drop us a note by email if those FAQs aren't addressing your specific query. We're going to be running more webinars in the coming months, and so please sign up to our newsletter to make sure that you get information about them, and follow us on Twitter. Today booked out very quickly, so it's better to be signed up to get the information rather than relying on a friend forwarding the information on to you. And if you have an idea for a webinar, please do drop us an email on vamhn@kcl.ac.uk or on Twitter. So thank you so much again for logging on with us today. I hope you've enjoyed it and got a lot out of it, and to see you at another event soon. Thank you so much to our 4 speakers for your time and all of the work that you've done to bring to us today and to prepare for today. I think everybody's taken so much away from it. The recording of the event will be online soon, so if there's anything that you've missed or want to listen back to or share with your colleagues, you'll be able to do that soon. Thank you so much again. Take care and hope to see you again soon.
Thanks.